Warm welcome to this episode of Bright to Stormy, the everyday podcast with Olli Schmidt. Today's episode is about self-doubt, and as is tradition here, I'm not doing this alone. I've invited a fantastic interview guest. With me is Nina Lizon. She's a trained coach with self-doubt being her main focus. She particularly enjoys working with women. She has a background in communication studies, has spent a long time working in marketing, holding a leadership position, and then began training as a coach. Today, she spends half of her time with us at PME Family Service and the other half continuing to work independently as a coach. A warm welcome to you, Nina Lizon.
Thank you so much, dear Olli, for that lovely introduction. The listeners can't see it, but I'm beaming from ear to ear. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And we'll dive right into the topic of self-doubt. That's what we're going to talk about today. What is it? How do we deal with it? And yes, what can we possibly do about it? At the end, there will also be some exciting tips, perhaps even more. Let's see. So it's definitely worth it to stick around. First of all, of course, I'm curious, dear Nina, how did you come across the subject of self-doubt yourself? Because looking at you now, one would think of self-doubt as the very last thing.
Yes, of course, I've had my own self-doubts in my life, no question about it. I came to this topic in a roundabout way because I would describe myself as a very confident woman who takes the lead and tackles tasks, always having a positive, optimistic view of myself, which is something many people desire. When I got into coaching and worked a lot with women on diverse topics, they initially came to me, whether it was about a new job, troubles in the family with a partner, or having doubts and concerns about certain things, wondering if they should go ahead with them or not. So typical classic situations of change that the women were facing, we would eventually get to the topic of self-doubt. I rarely use the word always, but here I use it consciously because when we dug a little deeper, we always reached a point where, to use my own words, it felt like an invisible rubber band was holding us back. And we often didn't understand why. Why don't I go forward bravely and confidently into this new position, into the new life, or whatever it is I have planned? And we can't often describe exactly what it is. I then thoroughly dealt with the issues of self-doubt and confidence and what it is that holds us back. This is how I came to my topic to better help my clients, because it's not that women come to me saying they have doubts, but rather they are either facing a big task or they notice something recurrently nagging at them, something afflicting them. That's usually the main hook.
This means that self-doubts are not presented plainly as self-doubt, but instead they express themselves in various situations repeatedly in various guises or manifestations.
Certainly. To give some classic examples is, for instance, when I can't say no effectively and I notice that tasks are piling up. We probably all know a colleague who always says yes. And eventually there comes a tipping point where it also starts to be detrimental to me, being unable to say no, or when I feel constantly responsible for ensuring everyone else is well, or when I strongly feel the urge to always please everyone and make everything right for them. Here I'm using the word always very deliberately because you can tell the pressure that's behind it. Or when I find myself constantly comparing to others, suffering from it, and putting even more pressure on myself because I always come out poorly in personal comparisons. These situations, or when I tend to not address issues, like to procrastinate, or if I'm afraid to speak up in meetings, these are all things that should make me perk up and ask myself, what's the reason? Because usually these are things we would actually like to change or approach differently.
You've already mentioned always a few times. We consultants or coaches, that really raises our antennas. Those generalizations like always, everything, never, make us very alert. And of course, you're right that one has to be cautious using them. And in this case, it fits. It also reminds me a bit of the issue of perfectionism.
Yes, and when we say that little word, it already involves a certain degree of suffering. And if we take a close look, it's not like I'm always plagued by doubts. But when I do have strong doubts in certain situations, I quickly get the impression that I'm always plagued by doubts, or that things never really move forward for me, and that I always fare poorly and can't do anything really well, because then I naturally focus on this viewpoint, and as our brains work, I start looking for proof of this perspective. Then, in the next step, I arrive at a statement like, well, no wonder it didn't work out. Nothing ever works out for me.
Yes, that brings us to the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
What's it called again? Whether I think I can do it or I think I can't, I'll be right every time.
Exactly, yes.
Yes, a self-fulfilling prophecy. That means I behave in a way beforehand that leads me to the result which I was convinced of from the start.
Or, and this is a big issue in coaching, I avoid situations. I constantly sabotage myself. And I know that there could actually be more for me. I could dare to do more. I could believe in more change for myself, but I don't. There's a light on the horizon. I actually do want to achieve something, but I'm not even starting out. I'm not facing the situation at all. And then, forgive me for adding this, it becomes a shame because there's so much potential in that I could really implement the things I desire from my life. We are talking about life themes here. Do I dare to do what is important to me, or am I not even starting out?
This is how I experience consulting. It has always been my idea, my wish to work with people. I have always had a way with people, always been a good listener. I've had many experiences where people would come to me, share their stories, and then say, that felt good. Thanks a lot for that. And then I wanted to do this professionally. And that's when it hit, right? You actually have no idea about this. Well, I studied social work, but they said just social work isn't enough. You have to add something else. So then I undertook coaching training. But what if someone comes with a serious psychological issue? Hence, I also trained as an alternative practitioner for psychotherapy. But now they said you still lack proper methods. Hence, I did another training in Rogerian talk therapy. And.
And you can tell you're never done. We coaches, of course, are also people who like to continue our education for the benefit of our clients. But if I constantly feel like I need to go the extra mile because I'm not good enough yet, there is that one situation among 1,000 for which I must also prepare as best as possible. Then it starts to become, describe it as you like, at some point you start to think, man, this isn't really relaxing what I'm doing, is it?
Exactly. And I myself would never have thought of it. Because I was so caught up in this mindset that I had to first become good before I could even start advising people or working with them. And the trainer in the conversational therapy training, which is called Client-Centered Conversation Guidance, according to Rogers, said to me back then, Oliver, what else do you want to do before you feel ready to work with people? You've already got what it takes. And that was the push I needed to finally get started. I worked as a freelancer for a while and have now been here at PME Family Service for 4.5 years.
Yes, I also have a great example that I'd like to share. As you said, I'm now at a 50-50 point. I'm half involved with PME and I give talks there on mental health and leadership and all the other crucial topics in organizations. And when I started last year, I initially thought, oh dear, can I really do this? But then with all the tools and techniques that I already have, I managed to prepare myself. And then I had a conversation that really opened my eyes last summer with one of my trainers. I told her about this great new job I have, how comfortable I feel here, and what a great personal development it is as well. And then I said to her, I was so lucky to get this job. And here's the interesting part, because she said to me, no, Mrs. Lizon, it wasn't luck. You are exactly where you should be because you have the skills. And to touch again briefly on women, we often downplay ourselves and are fully convinced, as I said last year, that it's all luck when something good happens. No, we have worked to get where we are. And of course, a positive aspect of doubt we also develop through it. Doubts can indeed lead to positive outcomes in that they motivate us to try hard, to deliver well, and to reach the point in life where we already are. It just shouldn't prevent us from continuing on our path, and for me, that's always the slight difference. Doubts are absolutely human, and they should be there. The question is, do I proceed regardless, or do I say, no, I won't do anything that I actually desire because it won't work out anyway?
You've just alluded to it. It seems to be a typically female problem. A human resources manager once told me, Mr. Schmidt, when we post a job vacancy, and let's say for simplicity's sake, there are 10 requirements in the job description, men will step forward and say, I can do 2 of these things, I'll apply. And women will look at it and say, I can do 8 of these really well. I'm not sure about 2. Maybe I should apply after all.
Yes. Oh dear, that's like a stab to my heart straight away. Recently, I had a conversation with a mother who has 3 children, all adults now, 2 daughters and a son. And she said she raised them with the awareness that she wanted all of them to go out into the world equally strong and powerful. However, her daughters still tell her today, as grown individuals, wow, my brother moves ahead with such confidence, sometimes with the biggest nonsense. And I don't dare. And that is something crucial. So yes, even if I compare my family and still feel as a woman that I'm not as confident as I wish to be, even though my parents did everything they could for it, I still find it important to shine a light on the fact that imposter syndrome, when we talk about it, meaning intense self-doubt that holds me back from advancing in my job is a societal problem that we should all tackle together. We should all adopt a stance that supports women. And if there are any listeners here who also hold responsible positions in companies, it's important to reinforce women in what they do. There is so much untapped potential, including from women who want a job after parental leave but don't quite dare to, and who undersell themselves even during the application process. And the lady you spoke with has a very valid point. We must all work together so women have confidence, make themselves visible in their careers and in their lives. And this is also my heartfelt mission.
I find that a very, very beautiful plea. Because that is also a part of self-doubt, the way we tend to take things personally. Feeling like I'm not enough and I have these shortcomings. Yes, and I'm not sufficient, and very often these are indeed structural problems.
Yes.
Structural conditions that people then fail to meet, leaving them with the feeling that they are not enough.
Yes, we are coaches out of passion, you and I, as I know you, and in coaching we can make a huge impact. But I always like to say my goal isn't for women to start tampering even more with themselves to become even better, more self-confident, and then somehow convince the whole world. Because at the same time, we will still often encounter these structural challenges. So coaching isn't there to gear up women so that they can enter the fray, but we should also look at what we are allowed to change in society. How do we create a society or environment within organizations that empowers women so that they don't even have to fall into self-doubt in the first place? Nevertheless, it is of course the case, and I work a lot with women around the age of 40 who already have a family, then children and compatibility issues come into play, that we are socialized in a certain way. And if I do have these self-doubts, then I am allowed to work on them. And this is where coaching is a very, very effective tool.
And I think we should take a look at that again now. Earlier, you mentioned a term in a parenthetical remark that we should take a closer look at, namely the imposter syndrome. We've already talked about it in this podcast. Attentive listeners will be aware. But it's possible that someone might be tuning in for the first time today, and perhaps you might want to explain the imposter syndrome again.
Yes, with imposter syndrome, it becomes very apparent that there is a huge discrepancy between my self-image and how others perceive me. It is typically defined by already being in a very successful, responsible position, mastering my life wonderfully, having achieved a lot and being perceived as such by others. And yet at the same time, I constantly harbor internal fears and worries about whether I can continue to live up to all of it. So it often also occurs, especially when I've been promoted or have taken on a great new job. A typical thought is that tomorrow I will be found out and everyone will see that I actually have no idea what I'm doing. And when we say this out loud and you laugh, it's actually nonsensical. I didn't get this great new position because I'm unqualified. Others see what I'm capable of. It's only me who doesn't see it. And this is a crucial point, as it also leads to me not talking about my fears and worries of not being able to cope. Thus, it's also a very, very lonely issue when I have imposter thoughts. Sometimes I even start to have sleeping problems because I'm really so worried about being found out that I can't even enjoy my success or this great new position.
Maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but I think it fits quite well here. To get to the bottom of it, I always find it nice to ask myself, how do I even know that? So if I now feel like I actually can't do it and someone will notice tomorrow, to then ask myself, how do I know that? Where are the facts? Where is the source of this idea?
Yes.
And then I quickly realized, look, I've completed these particular trainings. I have this and that work experience. I've already reached these milestones. And I can see there are indeed objective reasons why I didn't just get lucky in getting this position, but that I am exactly where I should be and that I earned it because of my abilities.
Yes, and there you address something important, because often it doesn't help to start a conversation with others in a very casual or small talk friendly manner, because the others will just reflect back to you with confusion. They don't understand. What do you want? You're totally great, but in that moment I just don't feel that I'm totally great and that I'm doing everything really well. So I need to embark on a different quest. And what you mentioned is very important, to question my own thoughts. This is something we might not consider when dealing with self-doubt, but it's essential to question these doubts and put a big question mark behind it, focusing on what you also mentioned, the achievements we've already made. For instance, writing down my successes or whatever practical steps there are. I believe we all know these things, we just don't do them, because if we do, it's very effective. And often coaching can reveal helpful sparring, because in coaching I actually do these things in collaboration with my coach.
So here's another plea for taking such opportunities if they arise, like when considering undergoing coaching. Or if you're thinking about what you can do, coaching can be a good option because sometimes we can't come up with the simplest ideas on our own. And then you need someone to hold up the mirror and give you a bit of a challenge.
Exactly. It challenges me a bit and also asks the questions that I do not dare to ask myself. Those question mark questions, there are many great questions that we then utilize in coaching. And often I do not do this on my own, perhaps because I do not always have an immediate answer. Then everyday life kicks in and I just put it aside. But in coaching, we really truly address it. And that is what is so helpful.
Exactly, to really look at that and to really come to terms with it. Nina, in light of everything we've already discussed, like self-doubt, self-sabotage, imposter syndrome, which are all quite grim scenarios and heavy topics, are there also positive aspects to self-doubt?
So first of all, doubts are human. They're completely normal. We should also demystify that, right? If I have doubts, it doesn't mean I'm sick or incapable of living. It's perfectly normal to have doubts before major changes, or however you want to phrase that. That's how we are wired. We want to be well prepared for dangers and, of course, avoid potential hazards or challenges when possible. I've noticed that people who doubt themselves more, who maybe think twice before they rush in, often act more deliberately and therefore find a good and right path for themselves, especially when they start to really consider what the exact right thing to do is. Then they usually shine and really have a strong self-confidence that comes from within once they've found their path. And that's a very important point. Confidence has nothing to do with being loud or taking up space in every room with elbows out and boast loudly about all they can do. Rather, confidence is a deep inner calm, knowing exactly who I am and what I can do.
I am self-aware. I think that's a very, very nice perspective. It also has intersections with the field of resilience, which is something I spend a lot of time on. And there's this area of taking care of oneself and looking after oneself. And then I like to ask, who is actually the most important person in your life? And of course, you get a lot. My children, my husband, my parents, whatever. All of that is legitimate. All of that is fine. There is no right and wrong. My suggestion is always just to say, how about you try saying, I am the most important person in my life?
Yes.
Because only if I'm doing well, then I can also be there for others.
Yes. Another good exercise to find out about the state of my inner profound self-confidence is to see if I can say the sentence, I am good as I am, or I like myself as I am. I repeatedly experience in coaching that some women find it impossible to utter these words, or can only do so in a very convoluted way within a subordinate clause, and that it's very hard for them, and we really get to practice this, for this sentence to unfold in my life and find a true place, for it to be true that I am good as I am, which doesn't mean that I am not allowed to evolve, but I should also be able to simply feel good about myself. Self-confidence is nothing else but this. Instead of constantly picking at myself and always feeling dumb.
Yes, exactly. I find that really important. I would like to make a small disclaimer here. There's this personal development scene where coaches jump around on stage shouting, you can do it. And then there's this idea that you should stand in front of the mirror every morning and say, you're great. That's kind of the direction it goes. Okay, you can do that. And it can also have positive effects, right? But if I have those self-doubts, I mean, if my inner self doesn't believe it, then it's useless. On the contrary, it's a slap in the face every time.
And I believe that there are two things that listeners, both men and women, should pay attention to. First, what is the really right step for me? Often we aim too high right away and think, as you also just mentioned, that we need to feel super great about ourselves all day. Not at all, right? We should simply feel good about ourselves as we are, with all the mistakes and weaknesses that come with it. That's one thing. So what feels good for me? What also feels helpful for me? Therefore, I don't necessarily have to adopt a hype-up mentality, because that would be overmotivation for me. So it's all about finding a good balance. That's why I also like to talk about relaxed self-confidence. Otherwise, it topples over in the other direction. I think we all know these overmotivated people who want to drag us along with their hype-up enthusiasm. However, I believe that's not what either of us mean.
Exactly, exactly. It's just important to me to set this boundary and to make it clear. It's not about saying, let's go, I'm the greatest, but rather it's enough to say, I like myself.
And I am good just as I am.
From this attitude, I can then approach change much better. I say, yes, fundamentally, I like myself the way I am, or I am good the way I am. And at the same time, I want to achieve something at one point or another, or continue to develop. And that's totally legitimate. Now, we have already talked about what self-doubts are. We've also looked at the positive sides. Maybe we should take another look at the origins of self-doubt, right? We have already said that there's a societal aspect. But where does it come from that some people have self-doubts and others seemingly don't have anything to do with it at all? Or do we all in truth have self-doubts?
So I'd say it's not exactly easy to answer that, because I'm sure even very confident people encounter situations where they might feel some doubts or uncertainties. Let's just call it an uncertainty, especially when they're venturing into unknown territory. And this is again crucial, the terrain on which we operate, because self-confidence has a lot to do with what positive experiences we've had in our lives and instances where we might have stumbled and stored that as a negative experience, subsequently possibly avoiding similar situations in the future instead of trying again. The subject of failure is also a societal issue with us. Unlike in America, where failure is not so frowned upon, it's quite the opposite in our culture, particularly in entrepreneurship. That's one issue. And the other issue is that from our childhood, from the way we were brought up, from our socialization, we've developed certain strategies on how to best cope. And of course, insecurities and doubts can arise from these when we are adults, especially if we no longer need those strategies today. I say that in coaching, we don't focus too much on looking back and working on where these feelings come from. If that's a major issue for clients, I would rather refer them to therapy to thoroughly work on certain things, especially if they suffer a lot. Otherwise, we tend to focus more in coaching on how to deal with it now. Although I personally find it very helpful to look back at my childhood and youth at times and consider where I've developed certain habits or behaviors, or perhaps there are certain slogans from my family that I still carry with me, such as "nothing comes from nothing" or "no pain, no gain." And exploring these a bit is quite helpful. However, in our coaching, which I know you also emphasize, we must distinguish it from therapeutic work.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a very important point. I also like to do this. I find this explanatory model incredibly helpful. So there's nothing wrong with me if I have such a barrier, if something like that stands in my way, such a behavior, such a belief, right? It could well be that it once served well in the past, and that it, just as you have just mentioned, now stands in my way as an adult. But then it's not wrong per se. It was once incredibly helpful. It might have even ensured that I got along well in the family or in my life, right? And now I no longer need it because I have evolved, and then I am allowed to let it go. And that's where we are in coaching. That is to say, all right, I have something that I want to get rid of. How do I do that?
Exactly, very good.
And just like you say, if there's more to it, or if I feel like I need to dig deeper, or when there is actual distress, yes. So if I keep hitting the same walls, if my life is actually being limited by it, we've already talked about avoidance. So if I isolate myself, if I don't go out at all because of it, or if
I develop unhealthy strategies, right?
exactly, yes, then it's a case for therapy. And then I should indeed focus on that again. And we can certainly pave the way for that. We can accompany there. We can provide support. But everything else is then the work of therapy.
Yes, I can actually think of some good news when it comes to the topic of work. Self-confidence is like a muscle that we can train, and self-confidence is also fluid. It's not the case that self-confidence is always the same throughout my entire life, and I'm not always as confident in my job as I am in my personal life, and vice versa. Self-confidence is something we can work on in different areas, and it's also okay to go through a phase in my life due to a setback or a stroke of fate where my self-confidence isn't that strong. Especially then, knowing that I can rebuild self-confidence, regain self-trust and confidence is really helpful knowledge when I'm not feeling well. It's comforting to know that different times will come and that I can advance myself again. This is possible even with the support of others, be it family or friends.
I also think it's really important to look at what's going well. If I notice that I have low self-confidence in a certain area, for example, in my career, maybe because I have just faced a defeat, like being fired or something, in which areas do I have confidence? And how do I do that? Where do I get that from? What strategies do I have in that area? And what can I maybe also use for the area where I currently have a bit less self-confidence?
Absolutely. Sometimes, as studies have well established, it's about pretending at first, then real confidence follows. I'm reluctant to use the phrase "fake it until you make it" because it somewhat sounds like cheating, but we notice it when we carry ourselves confidently, assume a confident posture, and step out of the house that way. It feels different compared to sitting with slumped shoulders and drooping facial expressions, which the listeners unfortunately can't see right now. I even think my voice changes accordingly. You can notice this in the podcast too. That's where we can work with our body, build body awareness, and this in turn supports mental confidence.
Exactly, and you've just done it very nicely. Yes, consciously. It wasn't seen, but it was heard, and indeed you can hear it. Yes, and you can see it and feel it precisely. This brings us to the topic of embodiment, which is a new area. So you see, we're constantly opening new doors, constantly finding new points that we could explore, and I could continue talking with you for hours on end.
Oh, same to you, Olli.
We need to start heading towards the finish line now. And as is good tradition here, at the end of the episode, I would like to offer 2 or 3 tips to the listeners on what they can specifically do if they notice they are struggling a bit with confidence at one point or another.
Yes. If I have a very specific situation that I find myself in repeatedly, be it a team meeting or perhaps an upcoming job interview, or if I have to give presentations often and realize that a bit more self-confidence would do me good, then I think it's a great idea to practice it. We briefly mentioned earlier that we can trick our brain into believing that we're currently in that situation. Our brain can't tell the difference. And if we practice properly, wearing the clothes we'd wear to the appointment, standing or sitting as we would with all our materials, then we'll notice that we start to get a bit more nervous. Our heart beats a little faster. Maybe my voice breaks a bit. And that's exactly the right practice situation. That would be my tip if I'm facing a situation where I roughly know what to expect. Job interviews or presentations are the 2 examples I have. Practicing, putting myself in that position, carefully considering how I want to do it, and really walking through it once. Then I've already experienced the situation once. That helps in such situations.
If you can't imagine how this works in the brain, just picture yourself holding a really juicy lemon, a piece of that juicy lemon, and now you bite into it very slowly, savoring the taste. Anyone whose mouth is watering now knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Exactly. It really helps. I can say from personal experience, I prepared for my first presentations this way, for my first online and offline presentations both. And it's best to do this with another person because it increases my own level of excitement a bit more. However, this should definitely be someone who is supportive. So, for example, my partner or a good friend, because then I actually have someone in front of whom I have to perform for real. And this is another tip, that we should speak with people who are supportive of us and beforehand maybe even explicitly express doubts I have about a certain topic. I notice that I'm holding back a bit. It's not helping me at the moment if you tell me not to drive myself crazy. Rather, I'd like to enter into a genuine dialogue with you because I know we like each other and you can help me, and perhaps explore where I could instead focus my attention, where I could draw energy from, where I could gain confidence. And this naturally leads to the next point, that it really works well with a coach because they can provide an unbiased perspective from a completely different standpoint, and nothing in the life of the client, so to say, plays any role, right? Yes.
I've already mentioned it earlier, but I'd like to give this piece of advice again, namely the reality check. Whenever I feel that I can't do something or I can't achieve something, it's important to take a close look and ask myself, wait, how do I know that? So where do I get this information from that I'm unable to do it? Is it based on my own experience? Or is it something people have told me? Maybe my parents always saying, no, you better not do that. In my case, my music teacher in 5th grade always told me, Oliver, sing softer, you're ruining the harmony. Since then, I believe I can't sing, things like that. So where does it come from? How do I know that? And sometimes by asking these questions, I get to the bottom of the situation quite well.
Yes, and as I reflect, things like success journals are of course helpful too if we really do it from time to time. It's not about the quantity that I find a whole lot of things, but really about collecting personal accomplishments and writing them down for myself. What have I already achieved? What are my strengths? What skills do I possess? I also really like to use this in training and workshops because once it's written down, it feels quite different than just having a vague sense inside that I've done some good things in my life so far. To really write it down and then to revisit and enjoy reading it again and again.
Exactly. So this journaling, you can do it in different ways, but especially there, it is also a very powerful tool and can be very helpful. And I've experienced the most amazing things with it. Some people write in an app and that's totally okay too. But I've also met people who came to coaching and had bought a really beautiful book with a leather cover, and then they would draw and write in it in all sorts of colors, making really beautiful creative things. That's also where you can find your creative streak.
Yes, very nice. And for those who now think, oh, a bit more self-confidence, I too would wish that for myself. I find that in the end, to do the things that already make my heart beat a little faster, just thinking about them, but thinking, oh, but I really want to do it, and then actually doing it. At the end of the day, we can't avoid taking action in our lives if we want to lead a fulfilling life, experience great things, and pursue what we truly desire.
That was a lovely closing remark, dear Nina. Many thanks for taking the time and sharing all your knowledge and energy with us. It was great fun. Perhaps we'll see and hear from each other again at some point.
I had a great time too. Thank you so much, Olli, for having me. See you very soon.
See you soon. And many thanks to all of you for listening. We're always very happy to receive feedback at podcast@familienservice.de. And now I wish you all a great day, morning or evening, depending on when you're listening to this episode. Bye, you're Olli Schmidt.